Liam stood alone in the cold forest under the black sky, where the moonlight could not touch the ground and the trees were tall and silent like giant shadows watching him as he tried to keep his breath calm while the leaves moved softly around him, and he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat in the darkness. He had come to this forest to clear his mind and find peace away from the noise of the city, but as the wind moved and the cold air touched his face, he felt something else in the darkness, something that was not the wind, something that was not the cold. He set up his small tent near the old oak tree, where the branches looked like long arms reaching toward the ground, and he placed his small lantern inside to keep the darkness away while he sat down with his small notebook, trying to write something to keep himself busy. But every time he tried to focus, he felt the air change, like the night was breathing around him, and the silence grew heavy. He heard the sound of branches cracking in the distance, slow and careful, like someone or something was walking between the trees, and he stopped moving, trying to listen carefully. The sound stopped, and the silence returned, but now the silence was deeper, as if the forest was holding its breath. Liam stood up and moved outside the tent, looking into the darkness where the trees stood still and the ground was covered with fallen leaves that moved with the cold air. He felt his skin tighten as he looked around, but he saw nothing, only the shadows and the empty forest. He returned to the tent and closed the flap, trying to sleep, but the sound returned, branches cracking, leaves moving, slow breathing. Near the tent, he held his breath and listened as the sound moved closer, each step careful and slow. Stopping near his tent, he could hear the breathing, now heavy and close, like someone was standing just outside. He did not move, he did not make a sound as the breathing stayed near his tent for what felt like hours before it moved away slowly, and the sound of branches cracking returned. He opened his eyes in the darkness and waited until the morning light touched the tent before he moved outside to see nothing but the empty forest. He tried to convince himself it was just an animal, just the wind. But as the night returned and the darkness covered the forest again, he saw them, eyes in the distance, two small pale lights that did not move, that did not blink, watching him from between the trees. He held his breath as the eyes stayed there in the darkness, and the cold air touched his skin like ice. He moved inside the tent and closed the flap, trying not to look, but he could feel the eyes on him. Even when he closed his own eyes, he could see them in the darkness, bright and cold. The sound of branches cracking returned, and the breathing came back heavy and close. He held his breath and waited, but this time he could hear something else, a soft sound like whispering outside the tent. He could not understand the words, but he could feel the fear moving in his chest like a cold hand. He did not move as the whispering stayed near the tent, the breathing heavy, the branches cracking, until it all stopped and the silence returned. He waited for the morning light before he moved outside, and this time he saw them, handprints on the tent, small and pale, as if someone had pressed their hands against the fabric. While he was inside, the handprints were everywhere, facing inward, as if something had been inside with him all night. He stepped back and felt the cold move inside him as he looked at the handprints and the forest around him, silent and still. He packed his things and tried to leave, but as he moved through the forest, he saw the eyes again, watching him from the shadows, following him between the trees, never blinking, never moving closer, but always there, always watching. He walked faster, trying not to look, but he could feel them behind him, feel the cold breath of the forest on his neck as the shadows moved around him. He reached the edge of the forest and looked back one last time and saw them standing between the trees, tall and dark, with eyes that glowed in the darkness, watching him as he left the forest behind him. But he knew it was not over. He knew the eyes would follow him into the night, wherever he went, waiting for the darkness to return so they could watch him again. In the silence of the night, where no one could hear him scream, Mia sat alone on the cold bus seat as the streetlights outside flickered in the darkness and the rain fell heavy on the windows, making soft sounds like whispers around her. The bus was empty, except for one dark figure sitting in the last row, with a hood covering its face and hands resting on its knees. Without moving, the driver did not speak a word as he drove through the empty streets, turning left and right without looking back. Mia looked at her phone, but there was no signal, and the clock was stuck at 3:03 a.m. The bus lights flickered above her, and the cold air moved around her feet like soft breaths. She tried to calm her mind, telling herself that it was just a late-night ride and she would be home soon, but her heart was beating fast and her hands were shaking. As she looked into the dark reflection on the window, she saw something behind her, a shadow, standing in the aisle looking down at her, even though when she turned her head, the aisle was empty. The shadow in the reflection did not move. It stayed there, watching her with eyes that looked like black holes. Mia turned her head slowly, trying to see if someone was there, but the bus was empty except for the hooded figure in the back who had not moved at all. She turned back to the window, and the shadow was closer now, standing right behind her with a hand reaching out. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks. But when she opened her eyes, the shadow was gone. The bus turned into a dark road with trees on both sides, and the lights from the city disappeared, leaving only the bus lights cutting through the darkness. Mia stood up and walked toward the driver, asking when she would reach her stop, but the driver did not turn his head. He did not answer her. He just kept driving into the darkness. The hooded figure in the back moved for the first time, shifting its feet and lifting its head just a little. Mia saw pale skin under the hood and lips that moved without sound. She stepped back and returned to her seat, trying not to look back, but the air around her grew colder, and she could hear soft breathing in the seat behind her. Even though the seat was empty, she could feel the cold breath on her neck and the soft whisper of her name, Mia, Mia, over and over again. She tried to stand up, but her legs felt heavy as if the darkness was holding her down. She looked at the window and saw the shadow again, but this time it was not in the reflection. It was standing outside the window, moving along with the bus. Its face was pale and empty, with black eyes and a mouth that was open, but no sound came out. The bus slowed down and stopped in the middle of the dark road, and the driver finally turned his head, but his face was not there, only darkness where the face should be. Mia screamed, but no sound came out of her mouth as the hooded figure stood up from the back and started walking toward her, slow steps echoing in the silent bus. The shadow outside moved closer, pressing its pale hand against the window, leaving a cold white mark. Mia tried to move, but her body was frozen as the hooded figure reached her and lifted its pale hand, touching her forehead with a finger that felt like ice. The shadow outside moved into the bus through the window without breaking the glass, turning into cold mist that wrapped around Mia. She felt the darkness move inside her, filling her with cold and silence as the bus started moving again, the driver turning his head back to the road, and the hooded figure sitting beside her, now holding her hand with its cold, pale fingers. The bus lights flickered, and the darkness outside turned deeper, swallowing the road as the bus drove into the endless night, with Mia sitting there, unable to move, unable to scream, as the cold breath of the darkness whispered her name again and again. Ethan stepped out of his car and looked at the small roadside motel standing alone under the black sky, with a single flickering light above the office door. The air was cold around him as the wind moved softly, carrying the smell of rain and wet earth. He was tired from driving all day, trying to escape the noise of the city and clear his mind, but as he looked at the dark windows of the motel rooms, he felt a strange heaviness in his chest. He walked into the office and saw an old man sitting behind the counter, staring at him with eyes that looked empty and cold. The man handed him a key without speaking and pointed toward the last room at the end of the building. Ethan nodded and walked out, feeling the eyes of the old man on his back as he moved. The hallway was silent, and the air felt thick as he reached the door and unlocked it, stepping into a small room with a single bed and a small window covered by heavy curtains. He placed his bag on the floor and sat on the bed, trying to breathe and relax, but the silence around him felt too deep. He could hear the sound of the wind outside and the soft creaking of the walls, as if the building was breathing. Ethan turned on the small lamp beside the bed, and the light filled the room with a weak glow, but the corners of the room still felt dark. He lay down on the bed and closed his eyes, trying to rest, but the sound of scratching woke His eyes opened, and he listened as the sound moved across the walls, slow and careful, like something was inside. The walls trying to get out. He sat up and looked around, but the room was empty. The scratching continued, and he moved toward the wall, pressing his ear against it. He heard something moving inside the wall, something breathing slow and heavy. He stepped back and felt the cold air move around him as the lamp beside the bed flickered, and the light turned red for a moment before returning to normal. The scratching stopped, and the room fell silent again. Ethan took a deep breath and tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just an old building. But as he turned toward the window, he saw a shadow standing outside the curtain, the shape of a person standing still. He froze as the shadow did not move. The lamp flickered again, and the shadow moved closer, pressing against the curtain. Ethan could see the outline of a face and hands as the shadow leaned closer. He stepped back and the shadow disappeared. He rushed to the window and pulled the curtain open, but there was nothing outside, only the dark parking lot and the empty road. He turned around and saw the mirror on the wall above the sink, fogging up slowly, as if someone was breathing on it. From inside the room, he moved closer to the mirror and watched as words appeared slowly on the fog. "Help me." Ethan stepped back and shook his head, trying to understand what he was seeing. The lamp flickered again, and the door of the bathroom creaked open slowly. The darkness inside felt deeper than the rest of the room, as if it was alive. He took stepped forward and looked inside, but saw nothing, only darkness. He reached for the light switch, but the light did not turn on. The darkness stayed there, heavy and cold. He heard the scratching again, but this time it was coming from inside the bathroom floor. He looked down and saw the tiles moving slightly, as if something was under them. He stepped back as the tiles cracked and a pale hand reached out from the cracked fingers, long and thin, moving slowly. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out as the hand moved further out of the floor, followed by another hand and the top of a head with long dark hair, wet and heavy. The figure pulled itself out of the floor, slowly rising with the sound of bones cracking. Ethan fell back against the wall as the figure stood up in front of him, its face pale with dark, empty eyes and a mouth that opened slowly, showing darkness inside. It lifted its hand and pointed at Ethan. As it took a step forward, the lamp flickered one last time, and the light went out, leaving the room in complete darkness. Ethan felt the cold wrap around him as the darkness moved closer. He could hear the sound of breathing in the dark and the soft whisper of his name, Ethan, Ethan, over and over again as the darkness swallowed him. Ava woke up in her bed as the clock showed 3:03 a.m. and the cold air touched her face while the room felt heavy with silence. She looked at her dog, Max, who was sitting at the edge of the bed staring at the hallway with his ears up and his body shaking. She called his name, but he did not move, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside the room. Ava got up slowly and walked toward the hallway, where the cold air felt stronger, like a cold breath coming from the floor. She turned on the small light in the hallway, but it flickered and went out, leaving her in the dark. She heard a soft sound like scratching coming from the end of the hallway, and she followed it slowly, feeling the cold move around her legs. She stopped in front of the old wooden door that was always locked and hidden under a small rug. But tonight the rug was moved, and the door was visible, with small scratches on the surface, as if something was inside trying to get out. Max started barking loudly as he stood behind her, his eyes wide and scared. The scratching from behind the door grew louder, and she heard a soft voice crying from inside, calling for help. Ava felt her heart beat fast as she reached for the door handle, her hand shaking. From the cold, the crying grew louder and the scratching faster as the door moved slightly under her hand. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Slowly, a cold air rushed out, hitting her face, and the smell of earth and wet wood filled the hallway. The stairs going down were dark, and the crying came from the bottom, where the darkness was heavy. Max barked again, but stayed back as Ava started walking down the stairs. With each step, the cold grew stronger, and the air felt thicker. She reached the bottom and found herself in a small basement with old boxes and broken furniture covered in dust. The crying stopped and the silence returned, leaving only the sound of her own breathing. She moved the flashlight around the basement and saw a small figure standing in the corner facing the wall with long dark hair covering its face. The figure was shaking and whispering softly words that Ava could not understand. She took a step closer, and the figure turned around slowly, revealing a pale face with dark empty eyes and a mouth that opened, but no sound came out. Ava stepped back as the figure lifted its hand, pointing at her and whispering her name. Ava, Ava, over and over again. The cold in the basement grew stronger as the figure took a step forward, and the light from the flashlight flickered. The figure reached out with its hand and touched Ava on the arm, the cold spreading through her body like ice. She tried to move, but her legs felt heavy and her breath turned into white mist in the air. The figure moved closer and placed its hand on her chest, the cold reaching into her heart. As she fell to the ground, unable to move, the figure leaned down and whispered in her ear, "You opened the door, now you will stay." The darkness in the basement grew deeper as the figure stood over her, and the light from the flashlight died, leaving the basement in complete darkness. The last thing Ava saw was the pale face with dark, empty eyes. Before the darkness took her, Ava woke up with the cold air touching her skin as she heard the sound of her dog Max barking at the dark hallway. Outside her room, the clock on the wall was stuck at 3:03 a.m., and the moonlight from the window made the shadows on the floor look like black rivers moving around her bed. She called Max, but he did not stop barking, his eyes fixed on the old door at the end of the hallway that was always locked. She stood up with her heart beating fast and walked toward Max, who was shaking. As he looked at the door, the cold in the air felt like ice on her skin. As she reached the door and placed her hand on the handle, the door was cold and the wood felt like it was moving under her touch as if it was alive. She took a deep breath and turned the handle slowly. The door opened with a slow sound and the cold air rushed out, hitting her face with the smell of earth and something old. She looked down the dark stairs that led to the basement, a place she had never seen before, but now it was there under her house waiting for her. Max stayed at the top of the stairs, barking and growling as she took the first step down. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness felt heavy around her like a thick blanket. She heard a soft sound coming from the bottom of the stairs, like a child crying in the dark, and the sound made her chest hurt with fear. She reached the bottom and saw the basement filled with old furniture and boxes covered in dust. The crying was louder, now coming from the corner where the darkness was the deepest. She moved closer and saw a small figure sitting on the floor with its head down and long dark hair covering its face. The figure was shaking and crying and whispering words that Ava could not understand. She felt her legs shaking as she reached out her hand to touch the figure, but before she could, the figure lifted its head and looked at her with pale skin and dark, empty eyes that looked like holes in the night. The mouth of the figure opened, but no sound came out, only a cold breath that moved the air around them. Ava stepped back as the figure stood up and pointed at her with a thin hand shaking in the darkness. The figure started to walk toward her with slow steps, and the cold grew stronger around Ava, making it hard for her to breathe. She tried to move, but her legs felt heavy and the darkness around her felt like it was pulling her down. The figure stopped in front of her and placed its cold hand on her chest, and she felt the cold move inside her like ice in her blood. The figure leaned closer and whispered in her ear with a voice that sounded like the wind, "You should not have opened the door, now you will stay." The darkness in the basement moved around them like smoke, and the figure stepped back, disappearing into the dark, leaving Ava alone with the cold. She tried to scream, but no sound came out as the darkness wrapped around her and pulled her down to the floor. Her eyes closed as the darkness moved inside her, and the last thing she saw was the pale face of the figure with its dark eyes watching her as she fell into the blackness, with the sound of her dog barking far away above her in the house that was no longer safe. The end.